Many people think that there is a stark choice between faith and science, that they're somehow so incompatible that they can't coexist. These people have heard that the history of science is dominated by conflicts, with religion doggedly opposing science's progress, but eventually being overcome by science's success. To accept that view, though, is to accept and believe a myth. Next, please. This myth was deliberately promulgated in the 19th century as part of a campaign to secularize higher education. This gentleman is Andrew Dickson White, who was the supreme champion of that myth. And he wrote a very famous book called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. But the myth, including the errors, many errors of A.D. White, has been thoroughly debunked by historians of science during the past few decades. The truth is that people of deep Christian faith were instrumental in the founding of the scientific revolution and highly influential in its development ever since. Next, please. I come from MIT. MIT is, if you like, the high temple of science and technology in the US and perhaps in the galaxy. And as befits a temple, it has pseudo-Greek temple architecture, including fluted columns. And at the top of the fluted columns, if we were truly in a Greek temple, there ought to be the bacchanalian friezes of the drunken orgies of the gods. We don't have those at MIT. Instead, what we have are the names of the great heroes of science and technology over history. And some would say that the drunken orgies take place across the river in the fraternities. Well, a few years ago, we tried to make an assessment of what fraction of the great heroes of science over history, as represented by the names on the architecture of MIT, were Christians. It's a hard estimate to make, but the estimate we came up with was something like 50 or 60%. So that's the first point I'd like to make. Next slide, please. Serious Christians, believers, were a high proportion of the most influential natural scientists in the first few centuries of modern science's development. And these people, such as these folks here, are just a small selection of the giants of physical science who were deeply committed to their faith. Now then, there's the big question about the history of ideas. Modern science grew up almost entirely in the West, where Christian thinking held sway. There were, at that time, civilizations of comparable stability, prosperity, and in many cases, technology in China, Japan, India, and so on. Why did they not develop science as we know it? If it were true, as A.D. White claimed, that the Christian church's opposition had stunted scientific development for hundreds of years, why didn't science rapidly evolve in these other cultures? Next slide, please. A cogent case has been made that far from being an atmosphere stifling to science, the biblical worldview of the West proved to be the fertile cultural and philosophical soil in which science grew and flourished. The ways in which Christian theology contributed to scientific attitudes include these. A free contingent creation requires experimental study, not just armchair philosophy. A good creation is worthy of study. A world that is not itself God is safe to investigate without violating the divine. A world for which humans have been given responsibility calls for study as a duty. Our rationality, reflecting God's, gives optimism that we can understand the creation and God's role as a steadfast lawgiver leads us to seek general laws that govern the world. These are philosophical and theological encouragements to the work of empirical science, and when combined with the impulse of Christian charity to benefit humankind through practical knowledge, they led to a true revolution in understanding the world. So that's the second point. Next slide, please. I observed over the years, in my interactions with Christians in academia, that far from scientists being weakly represented among the ranks of the faithful, as one would expect if science and faith can't coexist, actually they're strongly overrepresented, and the sociological evidence shows the same thing. It's been studied systematically, for example, by Robert Wuthnow, whose data I'm showing here. And he established that while it's true that academics generally are believers in lower proportion than the US population as a whole, nevertheless, among academics, scientists were proportionately at least as likely to be Christians and often more likely to be Christians than those in the non-scientific disciplines. So next slide. So history doesn't support the perceived problem of coexistence between science and faith, nor is it supported by the prevalence of faith among scientists. Christianity grew from a fertile biblical worldview. It was founded by predominantly Christian pioneers, and it still attracts Christians into its ranks today. So where does the perceived problem of coexistence come from? It comes in part, I believe, from a misunderstanding of faith. Next slide, please. The anti-theists of today say that you can either base your beliefs on evidence or you can base them on faith in some authority. And of course, they say that their secular opinions are rational and based on evidence, while religious people are just some kind of irrational faith heads who just believe whatever they like or whatever they're told. But this is nonsense. Christian belief is not without or against evidence. The first Christians had the evidence of their eyes. They had walked the roads of Galilee with Jesus of Nazareth and heard his teaching and seen his healings and watched him crucified, and over 500 of them had seen him resurrected. And that was their evidence. It was sufficiently persuasive to them that they spread out from Jerusalem and in many cases sacrificed their lives in order to tell others what they had experienced. And those who heard them and responded had their own experience of Christ. So the Bible doesn't teach that faith is the opposite of evidence or of rationality. It teaches that faith should be our response in the face of uncertainty or in the very frequent situations where rationality can't give us all the answers. The Bible cites as examples of faith the acts of men and women who trusted God through adversity and challenge and were loyal to what they knew, even though there was much that they didn't know. And down through the centuries, the church has sought and found evidence and intellectual understanding, which inspired it to create universities and centers of learning and scholarship. So we need to develop a better understanding of what faith is. Next view graph, please. The word faith has several different meanings. They can be summarized as being of three different types: belief in propositions, confidence or trust in a person or thing, and loyalty to some person or ideal. And in Christianity, all three meanings are important, but actually the emphasis is on the second and third meanings, trust and loyalty. Notice, though, that faith is not inherently religious. It can be perfectly secular. I had faith in the sense of trust in the aeroplane that I flew down on from Boston this morning. I also have faith in the sense of trust in my wife, and I try to act in faith in the sense of loyalty towards her. There is such a thing as blind faith. That's sometimes called believism. It's the kind of thing that when asked, why do you believe it, the only answer that's given is, well, I just believe it, that's all. But Christians aren't called to blind faith. They're called to live out consistently a relationship with God that has evidential support even when there's uncertainty, and what we do know falls short of proof. Next view graph, please. Authority is a related concept that's often disparaged today. It's true that the religious belief of many people is founded on an acceptance of what they are taught by religious authority. Is it then authority that is the problem? Well, not really, because it's just as true that their scientific belief is an acceptance of the teachings of their scientific authorities for most non-scientists, and even for scientists, because there are many elements of faith in science itself. For example, belief in the consistency of the world, or trust in other scientists' truthfulness and loyalty to a research group or to close collaborators. And if we realize that faith, rightly understood, plays a vital role in science itself and in its reception by non-experts, then we begin to solve the perceived problem of coexistence. But the perceived problem of coexistence also partly comes from a misunderstanding of science. Next view graph, please. What I mean by science is natural science, the sorts of things that are discovered by physics and chemistry and biology and geology and cosmology and so on. That probably seems obvious to many of you. But a lot of confusion arises because long ago that was not the meaning of the word science. In the 18th century, the word was often used to speak about any systematic knowledge. After all, the meaning of the Latin word, scientia, from which science is derived, is just knowledge. But today, when using the unqualified word science, most people mean, and I mean, natural science. It is natural science that has gained enormous epistemological prestige based on its amazing success in describing the world of nature and the powerful technologies that it has spawned. Next view graph, please. The particular strategies that science relies upon to obtain its knowledge are reproducibility, that different people can get the same results from repeated experiments or observations, and an insistence upon descriptive clarity, so that the results of an experiment, even if perhaps not its interpretation, are expressed in unambiguous ways that all scientists can agree upon and understand. That often means, for example, measurement. Next view graph, please. If you want more details about this, then please read my book, Monopolizing Knowledge. This is the shameless advertising section of the talk. It's an examination of scientism. Scientism is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. Scientism has been enormously influential in our society and in the academy for the past couple of 100 years. But scientism is usually implicit rather than explicit. In other words, people don't just get up and declare their allegiance to scientism. More often, they simply presume it implicitly. I've given a couple of examples of more explicit scientism on the view graph, but implicit scientism is rife in the writings of the militant atheists of this century. So, for example, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, writes as follows: did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There is an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice, and it is strictly a scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter would be purely and entirely scientific methods. Well, look, the resurrection isn't a scientific claim, it's an historical claim. Next view graph. The way you establish the truth of historical claims, like the resurrection, or, for example, that Julius Caesar was stabbed to death on the steps of the Roman Senate on the Ides of March in 44 BC, is, of course, not by, quote, purely and entirely scientific methods. No. We need to use methods that are appropriate to the claim being made. And the evidence that we seek for historical claims isn't scientific evidence, it's historical evidence. And that'll be predominantly for things like documentary evidence, personal and maybe even eyewitness testimony, perhaps some archaeological evidence, and all gathered together, taking advantage of our general understanding of what makes people tick and of the attitudes and the thinking and the background history of the times in which the events occurred. Now, the reason why scientism is so important in the present context is that the critics of belief in God are fond of saying that religion is irrational because there's no evidence for God. But what they're really saying is that there's no scientific evidence. There's plenty of historical evidence for the claims of Christianity. I'll agree that history and the truth of Christianity cannot be established scientifically. But my position is that science is obviously not all of knowledge. It's not the only route to knowledge, and because scientism is simply a mistake. And the most important clarification in understanding the relationship between science and faith is to recognize that there are many different routes to knowledge, and science is just one of them. If you artificially elevate science into a monopoly of knowledge, then yes, you undermine religion, but you also undermine lots of other non-scientific disciplines like history or philosophy or literature or the law or the arts and so on. Next slide, please. So scientism is the biggest barrier to coexistence. It misleads many to think that the non-scientific disciplines need to be turned into science. It misleads some scientists to overreach and pretend that science has refuted religion. And it misleads Christians into thinking that gaps in scientific knowledge ought to be a cause for satisfaction. These mistakes are what undermine coexistence. Now, the key antidote to scientism, I believe, is to realize that science is not all the knowledge there is, and in particular, that different descriptions of phenomena at different levels can simultaneously be valid. This is commonplace within the natural sciences, but it also needs to be advocated for the levels of description that go beyond science. There can be scientific descriptions which avoid purposeful explanation as an operational presupposition of science, and there can be human and personal and purposive explanations, all of which can simultaneously be true. So to illustrate this, next view graph, please, consider the human person. You might say that I am an assembly of electrons and quarks interacting through quantum chromodynamics and the electroweak forces. Next. I'm a mixture of a wide variety of chemical elements, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, etc. Next, I'm a wonderful assembly of cooperating cells guided by genetic codes. Next, I'm a biochemical machine powered by bioenergy. I am a mammal, next, with blood, warm blood and hair. Next, I'm a human with consciousness and intelligence. Next, I am a husband, a lover, a father, a teacher. Next, I am a sinner saved by grace. Next, I'm an eternal spirit, beloved by God. Next, I am all of these things, and not one of them rules out the others once we set aside scientism. Well, let me close by talking a little bit more about faith. And here's why I say that my Christian faith is reasonable. Next, please. It's based upon an assessment of many different types of reasons. Most of those reasons for belief in God are not scientific, but they are nevertheless logical and rational. The most important types of reasons for me personally are a combination of the historical evidence and personal religious experience. So my faith is based on experience, but not the certainty of reproducible scientific experiments. Still, that's not a reason to discount it, because like everyone else, I make small and large decisions almost every moment of my waking life on minimal evidence beyond personal preference and impulse. That's what it means to be sentient. If history is any judge, it is people who act boldly and with determination and commitment, even in the face of risk and in the absence of complete information, who are successful in the world. And such people are called men and women of action. They act in accordance with a view of the world which is plausible but unproven. That is, they act on faith. And I think my religious faith is quite simply the same principle applied to matters of God and the Spirit. That's actually not all or everything that the Christian faith is, because Christians over the centuries have experienced by faith what we take to be a personal relationship to God. Next, please. Arthur Stanley Eddington was the discoverer of galaxies and of the internal physical structure of the stars. And he put his view like this. In the case of our human friends, we take their existence for granted. We could read philosophical arguments designed to prove the non-existence of each other, and perhaps even be convinced by them, and then laugh together over so odd a conclusion. I think it is something of the same kind of security we should seek in our relationship with God. Next. Can science explain even something as familiar as friendship? No, rather obviously not. Science's methods don't lend themselves to that topic. Does the fact that science can't explain friendship mean there's no knowledge or reality in friendship? Of course not. Friendship is a reality that can't be discovered or explained by science. Science obviously coexists with friendship, and it can coexist equally well with Christianity. In fact, what I've tried to show you very briefly this evening is that there is a much more constructive relationship between science and Christianity than mere coexistence. There is a sense in which the Christian faith leads to science. And though I haven't developed this idea this evening for lack of time, there's also a sense in which science leads to God. The Christian faith concerns personality, intention, and significance, topics that science's methods preclude it from studying. Christians like me say that those topics are actually the most important, because the universe is the creation of a personality. And that belief can coexist with science, but not with scientism. But then scientism is a fallacy. Thank you very much for listening.